Hey, it's Chris Niccolls here from Bow River Troutfitters. And you know, a lot of people when they start out, they struggle to catch fish because the presentation of the flies just isn't what the fish want. Now, rod choice, reading the water, proper mending, proper casting, those are all important. But one thing that gets really overlooked is actually just presenting the flies at the proper depth where the fish are interested in them. So today, what I want to show you is all the tackle and gear that you need to either float your flies properly or get them to sink right to the strike zone. Let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is dry fly fishing and getting those dry flies to float nice and high on the water where the fish will take them. Now, if you don't use any sort of floatant to keep those flies floating high, they're going to get waterlogged quickly, they're going to constantly sink under the water, and that might not be what you want. So the first product I'm going to show you, this is just a classic floatant gel. There's many different kinds. I just want to show you the gear so that when you go to your local shop, you'll have an idea of what you're shopping for. Now what this is basically a gel that you just work very lightly into your fly, less is more, and it's just going to basically repel water. So when that fly lands on the water, it's hydrophobic, it floats nice and high, and it doesn't get waterlogged. Now here we've got a pretty similar product. This is basically the same stuff, but it's in a thicker paste. This is Loons Payette paste, or like old school mucilin would be very similar. Same idea is that you just work it in with your fingers, get a little bit on there, work it into the fly, and it'll do the same thing as a floatant gel. What I like about these though is the consistency is thicker. So, if you're throwing this in your bag, sometimes the liquid on a hot day can get really runny, might leak or something like that. I find that this just stays put in the case a little bit better, but they do the same thing. All right, now this is another product, Agra, cute name of course, but it really does work. This is a different kind of material. This is basically like a pre-treatment for your fly, and we actually find this to be really effective. The best way to use this is to treat your flies the day ahead, let it dry thoroughly on the fly, and then you can just fish with those, and it really does repel water. You can use this though at the stream side. The only trick is you really want to dry it out. So if you dip your flies in there, generally you're going to do a lot of false casting at high speed to really dry it out, but it works fantastic. There was an old school trick back in the day to just soak your flies in Scotch Guard. This is a very similar product, but it works very well, and that's our favorite choice if you can do it ahead of time. All right, next thing I want to talk to you guys about is desiccant powders and drying agents. Now, hopefully you're having a lot of success, you're catching tons of fish, but that means that fly is going under the water, and eventually even the best treated dry fly is going to start to sink. It's going to get waterlogged. Best thing to do is if you have another copy of that fly, treat it, switch it out, and start fishing again. But if it's your favorite fly or you only got one left and it's working, then you can use a desiccant agent. This is basically a drying agent. You either dip your fly into this shake powder or into these desiccant pellets, and basically what it's going to do is pull that moisture out, pull the water out, and let you treat the fly again to get it floating again. And this could be a really good way to extend your day on the water. You can even use things like Amadou patches, or even toilet paper can work really well. But if things are getting waterlogged, remove the water, treat it again, and you're ready to fish. So the last thing I want to talk about is a bit of a side note. It's not actually a paste or anything like that, but this is CDC. It's a special feather called Coule de Canard. It actually comes from a fairly intimate region of the duck, but the key thing here is it has a natural oil that the ducks secrete that makes these feathers float well in the water and be water repellent. Now the trick is they're very fine fibers on these feathers, and if you use a floatant gel or paste, you're actually going to stick them together, they're not going to float properly. So the key thing is, if you're using flies tied with CDC, you do not want to treat them with any sort of floatant. You can absolutely use the desiccant powders to dry them out, remove the water if they are starting to get waterlogged, and then they'll float really nicely again. And the idea with these, honestly, is that the rest of the fly isn't treated. It's going to sink a little bit into the water surface, and then the Coule de Canard wing on top is going to float, and that's exactly how you want those flies to present. So do not treat CDC, but certainly dry it out when it gets waterlogged. Okay, so far we've talked about floating your dry flies nice and high on the surface of the water. Now let's talk about wet flies, your sinking flies, your nymphs, your streamers, flies that we want to fish under the water column. In order to do this, we need to get them to sink, and there's lots of different tools and techniques. The first thing we're going to talk about, though, is the good old-fashioned split shot. Now, this can be lead, or it can be other metals like tin or bismuth. These are great ways to get those flies down. They come in different sizes. Let's talk more about that. So there's so many different sizes of split shot, and frankly, you don't need to worry about carrying all of them. I mean, there's BBs, there's ABs, there's AAAs, there's SGA. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. And I generally fish a lot of AB size. I find that I can use 1 or 2 if I really want to sink something down. But you want to have a good selection. Really, the golden rule, though, is this. You only want to use as much split shot as is required to get those flies down in the speed of water that you're fishing to the right depth quickly. You don't want too much weight. That's going to make your strikes feel a little insensitive. You're going to hang up on bottom a lot, and honestly, it's going to be harder to cast. But if you have too little weight and it's just not getting the flies down fast enough, it's not going to do any good catching fish. So it's really about having the right selection and then really judging how deep is the hole that I'm trying to fish and how fast is that water moving. If I've got a really fast run that drops right down into a deep hole, I definitely want to go with more weight. But if I have more of a shallow run or a bucket and I just want to pass some nymphs through there, I would definitely go with lighter split shot. Slower water, more time for things to sink and get to the strike zone, and then my takes should be more sensitive. Also remember, you got to factor in the weight of your fly. If it's an unweighted fly, you might need more split shot. But if it already has a bead head on it, you might not need to go over the top with a lot of extra weight. It is easier said than done. You really got to judge the water conditions, but with practice, you'll get it. Now, on the subject of weighted flies, if you're buying flies from a shop, you are going to be limited to what they offer, but most fly shops will give you a selection of brass beaded nymphs or even the heavier tungsten beaded nymphs that really go down fast. But when you start tying your own flies, you've got a lot of choice here because now you can choose how much and how thick of a lead wire to put on there, what kind of bead, what material, how heavy and large it is, and that can all let you just fine tune those flies for the water that you like to fish. Now, there's a lot of situations where having just a bead on a fly is enough and you won't have to add split shot, especially if you're doing high sticking nymphing or fishing shallower or slower waters. One trick that I really like to do often is use a really big, heavy fly with a lot of weight. So I'll tie something like a stonefly nymph like this, tungsten bead, wrap a lot of lead wire around, and then in a lot of cases I don't even need to split shot. This becomes my bottom fly, sinks the whole rig down nice and quick. I can have lighter, buoyant flies higher up the leader from this, and that could be a really nice way to just keep things simple, not have to have any hinges where those split shots attach to the leader, and that's a really nice trick to try out. There's another product that I want to talk about, and I'll be the first to admit that I really don't use it very often. Not a lot of anglers do, and we really should use it more so. And that's this stuff. This is called Zinc. This is actually a sinkant, not a floatant, although it looks almost exactly the same. So make sure you're using the right stuff. What this will do is actually saturate the fly, get rid of air bubbles, and break the surface tension of the water. You see, even with a weighted nymph, when you throw it into the water, it's going to have air bubbles trapped in the materials, and it's going to want to resist sinking. It's going to be up to the split shot or the bead to make it go down. But if you add something like this, it actually really speeds up the sink rate to the point where you might not even need to use split shot. You can also use this stuff on your mono leaders. So this is really handy, for example, if you're fishing dry flies, but you want your leader to be off the surface of the water. You know, sometimes fish can see that pattern of the mono on the surface of the water. This will drop it just below the surface and make it more invisible. This could be a really useful material that you should give a try. So the last thing I want to talk to you guys about is sink tips and leader choices to also get those flies down. Now, the first thing I want to mention, there is a material called fluorocarbon, which is different than monofilament nylon that we would normally use with our leaders and tippets. As we just talked about, monofilament nylon actually floats on the surface of the water and will resist sinking. Fluorocarbon, though, is an interesting material because it does not float on water. It will actually sink on its own. So that could be a really handy way to get that leader below the water surface on a dry fly, or if you're using a nymph rig, just to add to the overall sink rate of the whole rig. But if you're fishing streamers, which are flies that we pull through the water column or swing with the current, then you want to get those flies down deep as well. You can use split shot, but it tends to give the streamer a jigging, flipping action. Sometimes fish like that, sometimes they don't, but it's really hard to maintain a nice, even swing with split shot. What we like to use are these sink tips. This is basically a leader that's got a heavy tungsten coating on it. You use this instead of your regular eat leader, add on a little bit of mono after this to your streamer, and when you throw your rig in, the whole leader is going to sink down into the water, bring that streamer down, and let it swing across. Even if you're using a floating line, you can add this onto the end of it, and now it has a sinking tip. Or you can even buy dedicated fly lines that already sink on their own. Either way, if you're streamer fishing, we almost always use some sort of sink tip. Now, one question we get asked a lot when it comes to sinking leaders is, what does IPS rating mean? That stands for inches per second, and it covers the gamut, 1.5 inches per second, all the way up to 9 or even more inches per second. The faster that rate, the faster the leader sinks. And you really got to set it up for the water you're fishing. Here in Alberta, I usually get by with 2. If I'm fishing lower flows, summertime water, shallower holes, I'll usually fish 3 to 4 inch per second leaders with my streamers. But if I'm fishing in the springtime where the waters are up, the flow's up, or I'm just fishing deeper, faster runs, then I might switch to a 6 or 7 inch per second leader. Suffice to say, you got lots of choice. It's about customizing it to the speed and depth of the water that you want to fish. You don't want your flies hanging up on the bottom, but at the same time, you do want them to get down fast to the strike zone so they swing across where the fish are feeding. All right, I know that's a lot to take in. That's our beginner's guide to floating and sinking flies. Remember, once you learn all of these products, you can start to mix things up. I mean, there are some situations, for example, where we might use that zinc sinking fluid on a dry fly to actually make it go just below the surface of the water. If fish are coming up for emerging flies, but not flies necessarily on the top of the water, that's a great way to present them properly. Really, the whole name of the game is learning to use these techniques so that you do present the flies the way the fish like. If you do have any questions, which I'm sure you do, please leave those in the comments below. We'll absolutely answer those for you. Otherwise, subscribe to the channel while you're at it. We'd appreciate that. We'll always have more beginner's guides and how-to guides coming out. You won't want to miss those. Thanks for joining us. Like the show, and we'll see you soon with an episode of Bow River Troutfitters.